Hello, my name is Ed Frawley and I own Leerburg. In this video, I'm going to once again talk about how to approach using a dominant dog collar, because there's different applications to using a dominant dog collar. You have to either use it on a dominant or a reactive dog, or you have to use it as a backup collar when you use a prong collar. I've done this video a number of times, and it needs to be handled diplomatically because there are obviously different levels of reactivity. There's different levels of handler aggression. And how you handle these dominant dog collars varies depending upon the dog that's sitting in front of you and the problems you have with that dog. So there's other videos that we've done that show you how to measure the dog and why a dominant dog collar is better for dogs that have large heads. I won't go into that. But let's start with this reactivity and handler aggression issue, because in many cases it requires a correction. Now, let's understand about corrections. What's the purpose of a correction? The simplest way to describe why you give a correction is to get a behavior change. And in all of my courses, all of my DVDs, I say the purpose of a correction is not to punish your dog, it's to get a behavior change. And we'll do a caveat that's added onto that, to get a consistent behavior change. In other words, when you're going to correct a dog for anything, you can give a correction to get a behavior change. And if you're not handling it right, if you're not being consistent and correcting that dog to get a behavior change every single time he does it, they're not going to learn. They're just going to figure out, okay, I got a mind some of the time, and some of the time I can do what the hell I want him to do. And that's just exactly, dogs are not stupid. They're way smarter than what we think they are. And they figure that out. So the important thing here is when we start to use the dominant dog collar as a correction, it's not designed to give a pop leash correction. A dominant dog collar is designed to give upward pressure on the dog. Okay, there's a difference. Don't be doing pop corrections with a dominant dog collar. It's not the way to do it. When your dog is doing something wrong, and when you think that it needs to stop that behavior, when you think it needs to have a correction, say no in a normal voice. Don't get excited, don't get mad, don't get hectic, just say no and apply some upward pressure on the dog. How hard, how much, how long, completely depends on the reaction of the dog. A little Chihuahua, a little like I have, Pip, my Chihuahua, I don't need to use it on her because I don't have a problem with her. A Border Terrier, we have a Border Terrier. A Shih Tzu, we have a Shih Tzu. They all mind, but dogs that are that size, you only have to put a little bit of upward pressure on them, on their neck with a dominant dog collar, and they, okay. I'm not gonna do that. What you should think is, no, you're not gonna do that every single time. And going forward, every single time you do what you just did, I'm gonna say no, and I'm gonna give some upward pressure. Now, that's one scenario. What about the scenario where you have a large dog? Back in the 1980s, I had a business where I imported selection-tested young adult German Shepherds or Malinois for police service work. And then I would sell them to vendors who would do the finishing work, and they would go on to a police department. A lot of these dogs that I used to get came from Germany. They all came from Germany. And what happened there is the Germans are no different than us. They would get a puppy, they would raise it, they didn't manage it correctly, they got a dog that was a high drive, a lot of energy dog, and they didn't supervise it, and it got to be, 12, 14, 18 months old, and the dog started ruling the house, and they got rid of it. They got rid of it for behavior problems because they didn't know how to correct the problems. So then I would get it, and they would come over here, and they'd been allowed to practice bad behavior for a long time, and we had to settle our relationship. Those dogs, if you did something on some of them, if you did something wrong, they'd turn and come on you, and they'd want to bite you. And that's where I came up with this dominant dog collar thing, because a lot of the German Shepherds would have a big head and a slip collar to get over the dog's head, would leave way too much slack. So I designed the dominant dog collar. When a dog's coming after me and he wants to bite me, I'll say, no. I don't get mad. I say, no, you won't do that, no. And I'll put some upward pressure so he can't get to me. And if I had to do it so he gets his front feet off the ground, he learns very quickly, that's uncomfortable, I don't like that, so I'll stop. Now, when that happens, if you have that, you need to do this until he stops. You can't do it and then put him down and he's going to come right back on you. I'll say one last thing about these selection-tested police service dogs that I imported that wanted to eat my lunch and had to be retrained to not have that kind of behavior. All of those dogs went on to have a productive career as a police service dog. And had they been put to sleep, it would have been such a waste. Just keep this all in mind. So, not a lot of people have that. But here's the caveat. These dogs, most of these dogs that do this, have been allowed to get by with doing this. And the average vet or whoever who doesn't have experience working with handle aggressive dogs will say, put that dog to sleep. Rescue organizations, put that dog to sleep. I don't believe that that's the right thing to do. I know it's not the right thing to do because once I did this with these dogs, and I normally only had to do it 2 or 3 times, that was all it took. It was a complete behavior change as far as the dog and the relationship I had with the dog. Now, I still had to manage the dogs around other people, but that was on me, not on the dog. The way I look at it is, if you can fix something like this, and you can fix it relatively quickly and relatively pain-free, because it really doesn't, a dominant dog collar is not like a prong collar. Prong collar, you give it a correction, and a lot of times that'll make them more hectic, more aggressive, because there's some pain involved. That's not the case with a dominant dog collar. And if I can solve a dog's behavioral problems by doing what I'm talking about doing, rather than put them to sleep, I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. So now you have to be consistent here. And new dog trainers can get a little sloppy in being consistent. These dogs that are reactive, these dogs that are aggressive, either to you or they aggress to somebody else, you can't allow that to happen and forget it sometimes because it's not quite that bad. No. If you handle this correctly and you teach the dog when you say no, he needs to stop. If you say no and he doesn't stop every single time, he gets a correction. It doesn't need to be a fight with him every time. Just a little bit of upward pressure on a dog that's been conditioned to a dominant dog collar is enough for him to say, oh. Okay, I'm not going to do that anymore. That's your goal, to teach the dog to stop his behavior when you say no. And that's why I said earlier, don't be hectic, don't be loud, don't get mad, don't say no. You don't need to. The dog will respond just as well a no as you say no, as long as everything after that comes the same. Upward pressure, okay, I won't do anymore. That's what you want to do. And that's how you handle these dominant dog collars. Let's talk about using a dominant dog collar as a backup collar for a prong collar. Prong collars come apart. Don't listen to anybody that tells you that a prong collar doesn't come apart. They come apart. They usually come apart because the people don't have them sized correctly. They have them big, laying loose. They don't have them snug underneath the jaw and behind the ears and whatever. But even then, if it's on correctly, who knows why they come apart? I have videos of them coming apart. I know friends who have had them come apart and they didn't have a dominant dog collar as a backup collar or any collar as a backup collar. And the dogs took off and got in trouble. I know one case where lady came out of a training center in the parking lot. The dog had some reactivity issues. She popped the leash. It came apart and the dog ran out in the street and got killed. It's a sad deal. You don't want that to happen. Keep in mind, anytime a prong collar comes apart, he's coming apart because it doesn't come apart when he's just strolling down the street. It comes apart when he gets a correction. Why does he get a correction? Because of a behavior problem. So now we're going to give a correction for a behavior problem, the prong collar comes apart and you don't have a backup collar. And what happens? You got a dog that's in the middle of reacting to something and he's off leash. And most of the time, the people that are doing this don't have enough off-leash control to deal with the situation. If you have a prong collar, make sure you have a dominant dog collar or a slip collar or a leather collar to back it up. And that's why I designed a dominant dog collar for my experience with these selection tested police dogs. But then I went ahead and designed these prong collar leashes that I have our Amish harness makers work. Perfect. Here's the important thing. If you're buying a dominant dog collar for a reactivity problem, you have to size it correctly so there's only about that much slack. If you're buying a dominant dog collar to use as a backup collar with a prong collar, it can have more slack. It can have 4 or 5 inches of slack as long as it stays on the dog. So you may have an application for 2 different sizes on your dog. One for reactivity, one is a backup collar for a prong collar. But that takes me right back to the point that I made earlier, which is a lot of times if you have a reactive dog, you don't want to deal with a reactive dog with a prong collar because it can make them more reactive, it can make them more hectic, it can make them want to turn and bite the handler. So you're better off with a dominant dog collar because that doesn't elicit that kind of behavior. If you have any questions, go to our website. I have a lot of information on our dominant dog collar webpage. It's an important part of your training tools that you should have access to, and they're not very expensive. Thanks for listening. Cindy says sometimes I babble on too long, but I think in this case, it was important to babble for a while.